Hello, I'm Jordan Appleton, and today I'm doing a follow-up to a video which was produced by Tech Syndicate with regards to the AMD A10-6800K APU that's based on the Richland platform. Now, their video mainly focused on the difference in performance you would get by changing memory speed from, say, 1600 MHz up to 2400 MHz. So I decided that I would try this myself with my own benchmark suite and see what results I would get. So in the machine I've got the AMD A10-6800K. I've also got some Mushkin Redline Ridgeback 1866 memory, which I ran originally at 1600 MHz and then at the full speed 1866. I do have some Mushkin 2400 MHz memory, which I also tried, but the machine booted properly, but it never, once it hit Windows, it started to struggle with some issues. So I decided to avoid those tests. I can only put it down to either the APU overheating, or the memory control on the APU at least, overheating due to using a stock cooler, or possibly the motherboard, which is based on the AMD A75 platform. That may not really support the 2400 MHz memory quite as well as the A85X platform that they were using. As I say, the motherboard itself is an MSI FM2 A75 IA E53, and as I've already mentioned, that's based on the AMD A75 platform. So the first thing I wanted to do was to compare the memory running at 1600 MHz set by SPD to the memory running at 1866 MHz set by XMP. Now, the first test I did was all benchmarks Catzilla benchmark set on the Kitty setting, and at 1600 MHz the system scored 1848, and with the memory set at 1866 MHz the system scored 2748. Now that is an improvement of approximately 48% over the system running at 1600 MHz. That is a big difference. The second test that I did was with Heaven benchmark set at 720p with normal tessellation. Now the system running at 1600 MHz scored 425. The system running at 1866 MHz managed to get a score of 462, which is a much more modest improvement of almost 9%. The third benchmark I used was Cinebench, and the CPU score went from 3.53 to 3.57. Now that's a relatively small improvement. I would almost say that that is an erroneous result. I think we can consider that just a margin of error. The GPU score, however, went from 34.92 to 40.78, which is actually an improvement of almost 17%, which again is a considerable improvement. Now that's all well and good, but in the comment section of Tech Syndicate's video there was a comment with regards to the difference that the amount of shared memory makes. So I decided to look into this. My system by default shares 768 MB for dedicated video RAM, and then leaves the rest for the rest of the system. So my original results were with 768 MB shared. So I decided to run the tests again, but with 1 GB and 2 GB of memory shared, dedicated. So for the Kitty benchmark, that went from 2748 with 768. With 1 GB we got 2772, and with 2 GB we got 2778. Now, going from 768 to 1 GB, we gained almost 1%, and the improvement from 1 GB to 2 GB was pretty much nothing. So I think we can almost consider that a margin for error. With Heaven benchmark, we went from 462 to 463, and then back to 462 again. So I think any improvement there we can chalk down to, again, margin of error. With the Cinebench, the score was identical between 768 and 1 GB, so that's 3.57 and 3.57. When going up to 2 gigabytes, the CPU score dropped to 3.55, which says to me that it was using the memory for something at least. But again, that's a percentage drop of not even 0.6%. So I think we can almost drop that down to margin of error as well. With the GPU tests, the speed actually dipped, or the score dipped from 768 to 1 gigabyte. The original score was 40.78 and then went down to 40.13. But then went up again to 40.54, which basically means that we lost or gained about 2%, depending on which score you want to go with. Now that's all well and good, but I think again that's all erroneous results. So to sum up with that, when you're going from 768 to 2 gigabytes, it's not going to make much difference. However, I decided to go almost abusively in the opposite direction. I ran all of the tests with only 64 megabytes of shared video memory. So, the first one was the Kitty benchmark, and that went from 2,748 down to 2,462. The Heaven benchmark went from 462 down to 445. The Cinebench CPU test went from 3.57 down to 3.54, and the Cinebench GPU benchmark went from 40.78 to 40.11. So the biggest hit was obviously with Kitty, which went down by just over 10%. The next one was Heaven benchmark, which lost about 4%. And then the Cinebench CPU basically didn't notice, and the Cinebench GPU barely noticed either. Now, the reason for this is because you can almost consider the dedicated shared memory as the stuff that the GPU really needs to access. So that's almost a reservoir for the really important information. Then textures and things which are slightly less important can be left on the main system memory. And as it needs them, all it's doing is going from one to the other. Now, on a normal system with a dedicated graphics card, if you don't have enough graphics memory on the graphics card, it has to call the information from the system RAM and then load it and then try and operate with it, which takes, in computing terms, a very long time. It has to move it from the system memory to the graphics memory and then work on it. But since with a system with integrated graphics, the system memory and the graphics memory is exactly the same, all it's doing is saying, no, try looking over there for it instead of looking here. And as a result, the performance difference isn't that great. Now, I'm not saying for a second that it's a good idea to try and run your APU-based system with only 64 megabytes of dedicated graphics memory. It's obviously causing some form of discrepancy, it's slowing the machine down, especially when it comes to graphics benchmarks. But it's possible. So you could maybe get away with dedicating 128 megabytes, 256 megabytes, but really I would say leave it at the default settings, especially if you've got plenty of RAM. Just leave it set to 512 or 768, whatever it decides to use. But if you're using programs which are very memory intensive, then you may want to consider scaling back the amount of dedicated graphics memory if primarily it's going to be the main system that's going to be hitting the RAM. On the other hand, some games will probably not like the fact that there's only 64 megabytes, 128 megabytes of memory available, which is perfectly understandable. A lot of games these days do say in the system requirements that they require 512 megabytes of video RAM or a gigabyte of video memory, even upwards I think on some games, well probably not long off anyway. So with those games you would need to actually have that much dedicated just to be on the safe side, just to ensure compatibility. Again, when you're using the hybrid Crossfire, the memory size is also used to almost force compatibility. So if you've got a graphics card which supports, well, which has 1 gigabyte of built-in video memory, and you're using the onboard graphics features as well, you would need to have that matched up. Now, I believe that with Hybrid Crossfire it actually automatically sets that anyway, but it's just something to bear in mind. So that's my take on the AMD A10-6800K APU. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and thank you for watching.